In 1966, if you were watching television in the United States, you were living in a world of vibrant color, but that color was a lie. You see, the American NTSC system was a pioneer, the first of its kind to bring the rainbow into the living room, but it had a fatal flaw that turned every viewer into a frustrated engineer. If a cloud passed over the transmitter or a car drove by your house, the hero on your screen might suddenly turn a sickly shade of purple or a radioactive green. This was the never twice the same color era, a technical instability that forced every TV set to include a tint knob, a constant reminder that the signal was broken. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Great Britain had no color standard at all. They were stuck in the grainy, black-and-white purgatory of the 405 line system. To the outside world, it looked like the British had lost the race. But behind the closed doors of the BBC's research labs, a group of engineers was waiting. They weren't just looking for a way to catch up. They were looking for a way to win. They didn't want to just adopt colour, they wanted to perfect it. In 1966, the UK finally made its move, adopting a German-born technology and hacking its implementation so thoroughly that they bypassed the American mistakes entirely. They were about to set the gold standard for broadcasting that would dominate the globe for the next 40 years. To understand why the British waited so long, you first have to understand the sheer technical audacity of the American NTSC system. When the FCC approved it in the early 1950s, it was a miracle of engineering because it did the impossible. It crammed a full-color signal into the same narrow bandwidth used by existing black-and-white broadcasts. But this miracle came with a heavy price in physics. NTSC worked by using phase modulation to carry the color information. In simple terms, the angle of the signal's wave determined the hue. Therefore, if the signal's phase shifted even by a few degrees during its journey from the tower to your antenna, the color shifted with it. But in the real world, signals shift constantly. They bounce off buildings, they fade with the weather, and they distort as they travel through cables. This created a massive conflict for the viewer. You couldn't just sit back and watch a show. You had to play a game of match the skin tone every time the channel changed or the signal wavered. Therefore, the British engineering establishment, led by the BBC and the ITA, looked at the American experience and made a radical decision. They would stay in monochrome for an extra decade. This felt like a failure to the public, but it was a calculated strategic retreat. While the Americans were locked into a flawed standard, the British were free to observe. They watched the birth of SECAM in France, a system that was stable but technically cumbersome to edit. But then they saw the emergence of PAL in Germany. Developed by Walter Bruch at Telefunken, PAL stands for Phase Alternating Line. It was a brilliant evolution of the American system, but with a simple mathematical hack that solved the phase problem once and for all. Instead of sending the color information the same way every time, PAL flipped the phase of the color signal by 180 degrees on every second line. Therefore, if a phase error occurred, say, shifting the signal 10 degrees toward red, the first line would be 10 degrees to red, but the next line would be 10 degrees to blue. When your eyes saw those lines together, the errors cancelled each other out. Your brain did the math and saw the correct color. It was an elegant, self-correcting system. But the British engineers knew that adopting the PAL standard wasn't enough on its own. They needed a vehicle for it. In 1966, that vehicle was the move to 625 lines. This was a massive jump in resolution from the old 405 line standard, but it required an entirely new infrastructure. They had to build a network of UHF transmitters from scratch because the old VHF bands simply didn't have the space for the high-definition, color-rich signal they envisioned. But this created a secondary conflict. How do you launch a color service in a country where almost no one owns a color TV? And how do you ensure that the people still watching in black and white don't see a distorted, noisy mess? This is where the true hack of the British implementation came into play. The engineers at the BBC Research Department at Kingswood Warren began a process of ultra-refinement. They didn't just want a signal that worked, they wanted a signal that was pure. They focused on the relationship between the luminance, the brightness, and the chrominance, the color. In the American NTSC system, these two signals often bled into each other, causing cross-color interference, which looked like shimmering rainbow patterns on a newsreader's checkered suit. Therefore, the British engineers pushed for a much more precise separation of these signals. They utilized a piece of technology that was, at the time, a marvel of industrial precision, the ultrasonic glass delay line. Inside every high-end British PAL receiver, the signal would be converted into an acoustic wave and sent through a precisely machined block of glass. The time it took for the sound to travel through the glass was exactly the length of one television line, 64 microseconds. This allowed the TV to store one line and compare it to the next, physically performing the subtraction required to cancel out the color errors. But these components were expensive and difficult to manufacture to the necessary tolerances. Therefore, the 1966 adoption was a gamble. The UK was betting that the public would pay a premium for a quality that the Americans had never experienced. The launch was set for BBC Two in 1967. They chose BBC Two because it was already broadcasting on the 6 and 25 line UHF standard, meaning they didn't have to worry about the legacy 405 line viewers on that specific channel. It was a clean slate, but the pressure was immense. If the launch failed, or if the perfect color promised by the engineers didn't manifest on screen, the BBC's reputation for technical excellence would be shattered. The chosen battlefield for this technological demonstration was Wimbledon. In July 1967, the BBC broadcast the tennis championships in colour. It was the first time a regular colour service had been launched in Europe, and the result was a technical knockout. The green of the grass was stable. It didn't drift into yellow or blue. The skin tones of the players remained consistent from the start of the match to the end. The Americans, who had been watching colour TV for over a decade, were stunned by the clarity and the lock of the British image. There were no tint knobs on the new British sets because they simply weren't necessary. The engineering had solved the problem that the Americans had simply learned to live with. But the story didn't end with a tennis match. The success of the British implementation of PAL created a ripple effect across the globe. Therefore, as other nations in Europe, Asia, and Africa looked to modernize their broadcasting, they didn't look to the pioneers in the United States. They looked to the refined, hacked version of the standard implemented in London. Great Britain had transformed a German invention into a global broadcasting powerhouse. They had used their lateness to the party as a weapon, allowing them to leapfrog an entire generation of flawed technology. This era of British engineering was defined by a specific kind of technical arrogance, a belief that if something was worth doing, it was worth waiting for until it could be done perfectly. The transition from the no-standard chaos of 1966 to the gold standard of 1967 wasn't just about changing a few frequencies. It was about the transition from the mechanical age of television to the high-precision electronic age. It was the moment when the iron of the transmitters met the glass of the delay lines, creating a window into the world that was finally as vivid as the reality it was trying to capture. Therefore, when we look back at the history of technology, we shouldn't just celebrate who was first, we should celebrate who was right. The Americans gave the world the dream of color, but the British engineers, through a decade of observation and a year of intense hacking and refinement, gave the world the reality of it. They didn't just beat the Americans on screen, They redefined what we should expect from the glowing box in the corner of our rooms. And that standard, that commitment to signal purity and mathematical stability, is exactly what laid the groundwork for the digital revolution that would follow decades later. The conflict wasn't just about color, it was about the very geometry of the television image. In 1966, the British public was viewing the world through a 405-line window, a standard that had served the country since the birth of television, but was now a relic of a mechanical past. Therefore, when the decision was made to introduce color, the engineers at the BBC and the Post Office realized they couldn't just add color to the old system. They had to rebuild the entire foundation. This led to a monumental engineering gamble, the move to 625 lines. But this wasn't just a resolution upgrade, it was a total migration from the VHF, very high frequency bands, to the UHF, ultra high frequency bands. UHF was uncharted territory for mass broadcasting in the UK. But it was necessary because the VHF bands were crowded and lacked the bandwidth required for the complex color subcarriers of a high-definition signal. Therefore, the British government authorized a massive infrastructure project to build hundreds of new UHF transmitters across the island. But UHF signals have a shorter range and are notoriously blocked by hills, buildings, and even heavy foliage. This created a nightmare for the planning engineers. They couldn't just place a transmitter on a hill and call it a day. They had to map the entire topography of the United Kingdom to ensure that the shadows cast by mountains didn't leave entire towns in a monochromatic dark age. This geographical conflict pushed British engineering to its limits, but while the transmitters were being built, a much fiercer war was being fought in the laboratories of Europe, the war of the color standards. By the mid-1960s, the world was divided. The Americans had the NTSC system, which was pioneered by RCA and David Sarnoff. It was a masterpiece of compression, but it was fragile. In NTSC, the color information is packed into the signal using a method called quadrature modulation. It relies on two components, I and Q, which are combined onto a subcarrier. But the phase of this subcarrier is everything. If the phase drifts, the hue shifts. Therefore, the American viewer lived with the tint knob, a manual correction for the failures of physics. But the Europeans refused to accept this compromise. The French, ever proud of their technical independence, developed SECAM, Séquentiel Couleur à Mémoire. SECAM was designed to be immune to the phase errors of NTSC. It did this by sending the two color components on alternate lines and using a memory device to store the previous line. It was robust, but it had a fatal flaw for broadcasters. It was incredibly difficult to mix or edit. You couldn't simply fade between two SECAM cameras without demodulating the entire signal back to its raw components. For a broadcaster like the BBC, which prided itself on sophisticated live production and seamless editing, SECAM was a technical straitjacket. Therefore, the British engineers turned their eyes toward Germany and Walter Bruch's PAL system. PAL was the ultimate technical hack, because it took the best parts of NTSC, the efficient quadrature modulation, and added a simple, brilliant mathematical corrective. By reversing the phase of the color signal on every alternate line, Bruch created a system that was self-healing. But the British didn't just take Bruch's invention and plug it in. They began a period of intense refinement that would distinguish British PAL from its continental counterparts. They focused on the pulse and bar testing technique, a method of signal analysis that became the hallmark of BBC technical quality. To ensure the signal remained pure as it travelled through miles of copper and through the air, engineers used a specialised test signal known as the sine-squared pulse. But this wasn't just any pulse, it was a measurement of the K rating. The K rating told an engineer exactly how much the signal had been smeared or distorted by the equipment it had passed through. If a transmitter or a cable caused the pulse to ring or the bar to tilt, the K rating would rise and the engineering team would reject the equipment. Therefore, while the rest of the world was happy if the colour simply showed up on the screen, the British were obsessing over the transient response and differential phase of their circuits. They were building a signal that was theoretically as perfect as the laws of physics would allow. But this obsession with quality created a massive economic conflict. The hardware required to decode a PAL signal with this level of precision, specifically the glass delay lines, was incredibly expensive. In 1966, a colour television set in the UK cost roughly £300. To put that in perspective, that was nearly half the price of a small car. Therefore, the BBC faced a terrifying question. Would anyone actually watch? If the standard was too high and the sets were too expensive, the colour revolution would be dead on arrival. But the British had a unique cultural hack for this problem: the rental market. Instead of buying these high-tech machines, most British families rented them from companies like Radio Rentals, or DER. This meant that the risk of the technology becoming obsolete was shifted from the consumer to the company, allowing the BBC's gold standard to find its way into the average living room far faster than it would have through direct sales. But even with the standard set and the transmitters built, there was still the problem of the brush blanket, the specific way the PAL signal interacted with the luminance. British engineers at Kingswood Warren spent thousands of hours perfecting the notch filters and comb filters that separated brightness from colour. They wanted to ensure that if a viewer was watching a high-detail image, like a tweed jacket or a patterned tie, it wouldn't cause the screen to erupt into a distracting rainbow effect. This was a level of detail that the NTSC pioneers had largely ignored. But for the BBC, a single flickering pixel was a failure of the brand. Therefore, they developed the System I variant of PAL, using a 5.5 MHz video bandwidth and a 6 MHz sound carrier spacing. This gave the British signal more breathing room than the versions being used in other parts of Europe, resulting in an image that was palpably sharper and more stable. But as the 1967 launch date approached, a new conflict emerged: the geopolitical battle for Europe. The French were aggressively lobbying other nations to adopt SECAM, while the Germans and British were pushing for PAL. This wasn't just about engineering, it was about industrial dominance. Whichever standard won would determine which companies, Telefunken, Philips or Thomson, would control the multi-billion-dollar television market for the next half-century. Therefore, the success of the BBC's colour launch wasn't just a matter of national pride, it was an industrial necessity. If the UK could prove that PAL was the superior standard in the high-pressure environment of live, high-bandwidth broadcasting, they could secure the future of the British electronics industry. But the final hurdle was perhaps the most difficult: the human element. The engineers had to train an entire generation of cameramen, lighting directors and vision mixers who had spent decades thinking in shades of grey. Colour wasn't just an addition, it was a complication. Lighting that worked for black and white would often look garish or flat in colour, but the engineers at the BBC's television centre had a solution. They built the world's most advanced colour studio, Studio TC6, designed from the floor up for the PAL standard. They installed the first 4-tube colour cameras, which used a dedicated tube for the luminance to ensure that the compatibility for black and white viewers remained perfect. Therefore, even if you didn't have a colour set, the BBC's move to colour made your black and white picture look better than it ever had before. But to truly appreciate the magnitude of the British technical refinement of 1966, we have to go smaller, deep into the molecular structure of glass and the physics of sound. You see, even with Walter Brooks' phase alternating line technique, there was a fundamental problem. The human eye is good at blending colors, but it isn't perfect. If the phase error in the transmission was too large, the alternating lines would create a visual artifact known as Hanover bars, a flickering Venetian blind effect that made the image look like it was being viewed through a metal grate. Therefore, the British engineers realized that a simple phase flip on every other line wasn't enough to secure a gold standard broadcast. They needed a way to physically store a television line, holding it in a sort of electronic purgatory so it could be mathematically averaged with the line that followed it. But in 1966, digital memory didn't exist. There were no silicon chips capable of storing a video signal. Therefore, the engineers at the BBC and their industrial partners had to look toward acoustics to solve a problem of light. This led to the creation of the ultrasonic delay line, a piece of hardware that was essentially a high-precision hack of the laws of physics. Inside the television set, the electrical color signal was converted into an ultrasonic vibration, a sound wave, and sent through a specially shaped block of optical glass. Because sound travels much slower than electricity, the signal would take exactly 64 microseconds to bounce through the glass and emerge on the other side. This was precisely the duration of one horizontal line of a 625-line television broadcast. By the time the sound wave exited the glass, the next line of the broadcast was arriving in real time. Therefore, for the first time in history, the television could see two moments in time simultaneously. It could compare the current line with the previous one, adding them together to perfectly cancel out any phase distortions. This was the secret weapon that allowed the British PAL system to beat the American NTSC standard on screen. While the Americans were stuck with never twice the same color, a system that relied on the hope that the signal wouldn't shift, the British were using acoustic memory to force the signal into submission. But manufacturing these glass blocks was an industrial nightmare. If the glass wasn't cut to within a fraction of a millimeter, or if the temperature inside the TV set shifted too much, the timing would drift and the color would vanish. Therefore, the British adoption of PAL in 1966 wasn't just a choice of a standard, it was a commitment to a level of manufacturing precision that most countries couldn't match. But the challenge wasn't just inside the television set, it was in the air itself. As the UK prepared for the 1967 launch on BBC Two, the research station at Kingswood Warren became a high-stakes laboratory for the System I variant. They were moving from the old 405-line standard to 625 lines, which meant they were packing much more information into every second of the broadcast. But more information requires more bandwidth. And more bandwidth means a higher susceptibility to noise. Therefore, the BBC engineers developed a rigorous testing protocol that remains legendary in the history of broadcasting. They used the pulse and bar signal, a complex waveform designed to reveal every possible sin a transmission circuit could commit. If the bar part of the signal tilted, it meant the low-frequency response was failing. If the pulse part was smeared, the high-frequency detail was being lost. But they didn't just test in the lab. They took these signals into the field using specialized mobile units that roamed the hills of the British countryside to measure how the new UHF signals behaved. They discovered that UHF was a temperamental beast. Unlike the old VHF signals, which could curve slightly over the horizon, UHF traveled in strictly straight lines. Therefore, if a viewer lived in a valley or behind a large building, they were in a shadow, and the perfect color signal wouldn't reach them at all. This led to the birth of the gap filler transmitter, a network of hundreds of low-power relay stations designed to bounce the color signal into every nook and cranny of the UK. It was an engineering project of staggering complexity, a physical manifestation of the British refusal to accept the technical compromises of the American system. But as the 1967 deadline loomed, a new conflict arose within the industry: the sound of color. In the old 405 line system, the sound was transmitted using amplitude modulation, AM, just like an old radio. But for the new 625 line color standard, the British engineers wanted something better. They chose frequency modulation, FM, which was immune to the electrical interference caused by vacuum cleaners or passing cars. But adding an FM sound carrier alongside a complex PAL color subcarrier was like trying to fit two different languages into the same conversation. If the sound signal was too strong, it would cause buzz in the picture. If it was too weak, the viewer would hear a constant hiss. Therefore, the engineers had to hack the spacing of the carriers, settling on a 6 mHz gap between the picture and the sound. This system-I spacing gave the British broadcast a robustness that made it the envy of the European continent. But even with the signal perfected, there was the problem of the cameras. In the mid-1960s, color cameras were massive temperamental machines that required hours of warming up before they could produce a stable image. Most used 3 tubes, one for red, one for green, and one for blue. But if those 3 tubes weren't perfectly aligned, a process called registration, the image would have colored fringes around every object. Therefore, the BBC made a controversial and expensive decision. They would use 4-tube cameras. The 4th tube was a high-resolution monochrome tube that provided the luminance or the sharpness of the image. This meant that if the color tubes drifted slightly out of alignment, the picture still looked sharp to the viewer. It was another layer of technical insurance, another hack to ensure that the British leapfrog over American technology was absolute. But this obsession with quality had a social consequence. Because the engineering was so uncompromising, the cost of entry was high. Colour TV in Britain was, at first, a luxury of the elite. Therefore, the BBC had to perform a delicate balancing act. They had to justify the massive public expense of the colour rollout to a population that, for the most part, was still seeing the world in shades of grey. This is why the choice of Wimbledon in 1967 was so inspired. It wasn't just a sports broadcast, it was a psychological operation. The lush green of the grass, the bright white of the tennis balls, and the vivid colours of the crowd's summer fashion were a visual argument for the future. It was the moment the public realised that black and white wasn't just a different style, it was an inferior reality, but the success of Wimbledon only intensified the standard war in Europe. The French were still pushing SECAM, arguing that their system was more suitable for long-distance transmission across the vast plains of Russia and Africa. The British, however, had proven that PAL was the superior system for the studio. Because PAL was based on the same fundamental principles as NTSC, it was much easier for engineers to perform vision mixing, fading, wiping, and superimposing images without losing color fidelity. Therefore, the British implementation of PAL became the blueprint for the modern television studio. They had taken a German idea, refined it with British precision, and turned it into a global industrial standard that would endure until the arrival of high-definition digital signals decades later. But even as the green lawns of Wimbledon signalled a triumph for the engineers, a new and much larger conflict was emerging. One that threatened to turn the BBC's gold standard into a high-tech island of isolation. You see, while the British had perfected the transmission of live colour from their own studios, the world was becoming increasingly interconnected. The most popular shows on the planet, from Star Trek to the Monkees, were being produced in the United States. Therefore, the BBC faced a mathematical nightmare. The American tape problem. The conflict was rooted in the fundamental physics of the two systems. American television didn't just use a different color standard, NTSC. It used a different geometry and a different heartbeat. The American signal was built on 525 lines of resolution, refreshing at 60 frames per second to match the 60 Hz frequency of the American power grid. But the British PAL system was built on 625 lines, refreshing at 50 frames per second to match the UK's 50 Hz grid. Therefore, you couldn't just play an American tape on a British transmitter. If you tried, the image would tear, the colours would smear, and the screen would become a chaotic mess of electronic noise. But the British public demanded these shows. They wanted the vibrant, big-budget spectacles of Hollywood. This created a massive technical open loop. How do you translate the 525-line language of the Americans into the 625-line language of the British, without losing the very quality they had worked so hard to achieve? The solution was perhaps the most complex hack in the history of analog broadcasting: the standards converter. In the late 1960s, a team of engineers at the BBC Research Department, led by the legendary Peter Ranger, set out to build a bridge between the two worlds. Their first attempt was purely optical, a brute force method where a high-quality 625-line camera was simply pointed at a specialized 525-line monitor. But this resulted in a grainy, flickery image that failed the BBC's own K-rating standards. Therefore, they decided to do the impossible. They would build an all-electronic converter. This was a time before high-speed digital memory. Therefore, to change the number of lines and the frame rate, the engineers had to physically stretch and compress the time of the television signal. They utilized hundreds of quartz delay lines and thousands of transistors to build a machine the size of several large refrigerators. This machine would sample the American signal, store individual lines, and then mathematically interpolate them to create the missing 100 lines required for the British screen. It was a masterpiece of signal processing, a precursor to the digital age built using the sweat and ingenuity of the analog era. But this technical victory in the labs was just the prelude to the final act of the color revolution. By 1968, the no-standard chaos of 1966 had been replaced by a quiet, intense preparation. The BBC Two color service was a success, but it was still a niche channel. The real giants were BBC One and the commercial powerhouse ITV. Therefore, the government set a date for the Big Bang of colour, November 15th, 1969, known in the industry as C-Day. The conflict of C-Day was one of scale. To move the entire nation to colour, the engineers had to upgrade every studio, every transmitter, and every link in the national chain simultaneously. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about the logistics. Thousands of miles of coaxial cable had to be tested for phase stability. New UHF towers had to be lit up in sequence across the country, but there was a hidden hack in this rollout that ensured its success. Because the engineers had spent the last 3 years refining the PAL System Y on BBC Two, they had already solved the most difficult problems of signal interference. Therefore, when BBC One and ITV finally flipped the switch on that Saturday morning in November, the transition was almost flawless. The public, who had been hearing about the miracle of colour for years, suddenly found it available on every channel. It was the moment the black and white era officially died in the United Kingdom. But the legacy of the 1966 decision to wait and hack the PAL standard went far beyond the living room. Because the British implementation was so technically superior to the American NTSC and the French SECAM, the UK became a global exporter of broadcasting expertise. From the Middle East to Australia, nations looking to build their own television networks didn't look to New York or Paris, they looked to London. They wanted the stability, the sharpness, and the set-it-and-forget-it reliability of the British PAL system. This brings our story full circle. The British didn't win the colour war by being the first to cross the finish line. They won by being the last to leave the starting blocks. They used their period of no standard as a tactical advantage, allowing them to observe the failures of the pioneers and engineer a solution that was immune to them. They took the German PAL phase flip and wrapped it in a layer of British precision, from the 625-line UHF migration to the ultrasonic glass delay lines that made the tint knob a relic of the past. Therefore, when we think about the hackers of 1966, we shouldn't think of people breaking things. We should think of the engineers who fixed a broken reality. They realized that the world wasn't ready for color because the technology was too fragile. So they built a version that was robust. They realized that the American signal was a beautiful promise that physics often failed to deliver. So they used mathematics and acoustics to force the physics to behave. The last dab of this story is a reminder of the power of engineering patience. In a world that values speed and first to market above all else, the British colour revolution of the 1960s stands as a monument to the idea that quality is the ultimate competitive advantage. The Americans may have been the ones who first dreamed in colour, but it was the British engineers who ensured that the dream would never fade, never smear, and never require a knob to make the grass green again. They didn't just beat the Americans on screen, they defined the very way we would see the world for the next half-century.